Hello students and welcome to another video examining a poem from the Meantime collection by Carol Ann Duffy. These videos produced particularly for students who are revising A-level language and literature on the AQA syllabus, but they might be useful to you if you have a general interest in Carol Ann Duffy's poems and you like the kind of stylistic analysis that's familiar for the language and literature course. This one will be focused on the fourth poem in the anthology, and that poem is the poem Beachcomber. If you haven't already done so, you need to read this poem several times before you think about studying it so that you can begin to form your own impressions and get a good overall sense of the way that voice is presented, particularly in this poem. Beachcomber. If you think till it hurts, you can almost do it without getting off that chair. Scare yourself within an inch of the heart at the prompt of the word. How old are you now? This is what happens. The child, and not in sepia, lives. You can see her. Comes up the beach, alone, bucket and spade. In her bucket, a starfish, seaweed, a dozen alarming crabs, caught with a string and a mussel. Don't move. Tro. Go for the sound of the sea. Don't try to describe it. Get it into your head. And then the platinum blaze of the sun as the earth seemed to turn away. Now she is kneeling. This is about something. Harder. The red spade scooping a hole in the sand, seawater seeping in, the girl suddenly holding a conch, listening. Shh. You remember that cardigan, yes? You remember that cardigan. But this is as close as you get. Nearly there. Open your eyes. Those older, those shaking hands cannot touch the child, or the spade, or the sand, or the seashell on the shore. And what would you have to say, of all people, to her, given the chance? Exactly. So a few pieces of key knowledge before we move on to summarising this poem. Tro is an archaic verb which means to think. Archaic means language, words, lexis that has fallen out of use. Sepia, as you can see from the image there, describes the kind of red-brown tone of old photographs. In summary, this poem represents a distant childhood memory of time spent at the beach. It represents the struggle for memory, particularly the struggle for memory, and implies that great kind of unbridgeable distance between age and youth. If you've watched the video on Before You Were Mine, then a similar device is in play here, in as much as this is conceivably a poem about someone looking at a photograph of their youth and trying to evoke memories in a way that bridges that gap between the present and the past. The themes, therefore, are memory, age, and youth. Particularly, I think that infirmity and this struggle for memory, I think it's interesting to interpret this poem as potentially a representation of dementia because of the way that memory is presented in such an uneven and fragmented way. A secondary theme, perhaps, we could consider the way that this presents place and natural beauty. Throughout this poem, the poetic voice uses the second person to address the person trying to remember. So this poem is as if it were spoken to someone trying to remember, sometimes in quite a forceful and dismissive way. So we can characterize that spoken register as actually quite a direct and sometimes quite an urgent direct register. You could well interpret this device as a way of representing a kind of frustrated internal dialogue in the way that we sometimes have a kind of internal conversation with ourselves, particularly when we're finding something difficult. So here are some of the distinctive linguistic features that you might find in this poem. Of course, you may well identify other features in your own analysis, but hopefully some of these points will get you started when you look to analyse the poem. We've already mentioned that that grammatically This poem uses the second person, but there are also a variety of sentence forms which really help to convey a kind of a varied spoken register. So the second person, we can say, gives this poem its forceful and demanding voice, and the speaker is urging the subject to remember. Now that's conveyed through varied sentence forms, which capture a kind of spoken register. For example, we have interrogatives, how old are you now, which suggests that old age or uncertainty. We have these questions, in this case a declarative, i.e. a statement, which is intoned as a question through the yes at the end. An interesting feature here that really clearly captures a spoken register, because this is a feature of spoken language and not standard written grammar. We get lots of imperatives throughout this poem, such as don't move, imply this kind of urgency or need to control. And sometimes even more abstract or ambiguous fragments, like the word harder, which appears to be perhaps the voice of someone urging someone on or trying to motivate someone. The final poem, the poem ends on what is almost a kind of a piece of conversational dialogue, in that a question and an answer is given. What would you have to say to her, etc., given the chance? There is, of course, no response in the poem other than the word exactly. So these again indicate that kind of conversational question and answer format, but I think perhaps they imply to us that there is no answer in this conversation and that there is nothing but silence, because the woman perhaps has nothing to say to that young child, or is acknowledging this kind of futility perhaps of looking back, or the impossibility of communicating with your past self. In terms of poetic form, you might notice this poem looks quite distinctive on the page. That is a significant aspect of its discourse structure. The fragmentary nature of this dialogue is very much foregrounded through the use of uneven line lengths in this poem, and that includes many kind of awkward enjambments which are slowing the pace of the poem and giving it its unsteady feel. The poem feels almost stuttering at points, hesitant, delayed. In the final stanza, that is noticeably used, as you may notice. There's a kind of polysyndetic listing in that final stanza, which is very much foregrounded through the poetic form, as each of the aspects in this list not only has a polysyndetic repetition, but also is presented on separate lines, or the spade, or the sand, or the seashell. And this is a really emphatic feature, accentuating that sense of impotence that the rememberer feels as they try to recall these different aspects of the memory. There is a range also of symbolic imagery within this poem, and that beach setting gets evoked through this lexical field of concrete nouns. We've got all of the aspects that you might expect from a childhood beach memory: the bucket and spade, the starfish and seaweed, the crabs, the string and mussel, the conch, the sand, the seashell. Some of these is not just a question of listing features or including many features of the beach setting, but I think also there are kind of deeper semantics involved with some of these lexical choices, where they have a kind of symbolic resonance. An example might be the alarming crabs, perhaps indicative of childhood fears. You might also interpret perhaps the colour red as an indication of danger or of threat. As the child digs with their little red spade, we get this image of the seawater seeping in. If you've ever had a childhood day on the beach, you'll know that one of the fun things you could do is try and dig all the way down to Australia, but you can't do it because you only get down so far, and you actually reach the level of water in the sand, and anything you dig at that point will just flood back in. This is, I think, used as where setting is used symbolically as a metaphor for memory. And it's that futility of trying to recapture the past through memory, this kind of digging down to find, but you're endlessly frustrated trying to discover the bottom of your memories. You'll never get there because symbolically the water, of course, keeps flooding back in. That particular little passage describing the digging of the hole has got a pattern of sibilants with a number of those hissing or hushing sounds in it, and you might suggest that that is a kind of phonetic symbolism representing the sound of the sea on the shore, also evocative somewhat of the tongue twister, she sells seashells by the seashore, or this childhood beach experience of holding your ear up to a conch and hearing that rushing sound, which of course is directly presented in the poem. So overall, lexis and semantics combining there with aspects of phonology to create a really evocative and symbolic representation of childhood beach experience. In close analysis, here's an example of a little section that exemplifies some of the features that we've mentioned. This kind of stuttering or uneven discourse structure is well presented here. You might notice how the poetic form captures this erratic attempt to remember. We get this triplet of forceful imperatives represented in green highlighting there as our voice instructs the rememberer to go for the sound of the sea, to don't try to describe it, get it into your head. Quite direct, quite urgent, quite desperate. But that language in those three is idiomatic and unspecific. Get it into your head, go for it. It's a kind of, it captures this colloquial, normal spoken register. Then we get a sudden shift in the fourth line where we get this kind of sudden enlightened flash of memory. And that's this shift between the struggle to remember and a sudden burst of memory is signified in a number of ways. One is we get this little discourse marker and then which suggests a kind of a sudden development in the narrative. And then we switch into a poetic register, contrasted to the spoken register before. We get the platinum blaze of the sun as the earth seemed to turn away. The longer line suddenly becomes very poetic. This isn't presented as an unbroken line in the text, so the poetic form further helps foreground this little flash of memory as the line length obviously contrasts to the short fragmented lines around it. The line is also, as are many of the memories, presented grammatically in a fragment, and then the platinum blaze of the sun as the earth seemed to turn away. It doesn't have a main verb, so it is, in a sense, kind of a grammatically disconnected feature, which I think is helping to present this way that memory and recollection is some way broken and fragmented. Finally, as you can see from the pronouns that are highlighted red in this is again a feature that works throughout the poem. Pronouns throughout this poem accentuate a sense of ambiguity and confusion. Those second and third person pronouns, the your and she, they refer, we know, to the person who's trying to remember, and she refers to the child, but they're never really clearly established. We get certain suggestions or implications. We know that the she is a child and is actually described as a child. We know that you're the person being addressed. There are many sections that imply that you're is someone quite elderly, but we never really clearly discover who these two people are or what their relationship is. So in reading this poem, we have to deal with a lot of ambiguity. That sense of ambiguity is very clear, I think, in the line there, this is about something. I think that this and something are both deeply ambiguous pronouns. We don't really know what the this that's referred to throughout the poem is, and we don't ever really discover the precise significance of this memory. In many ways, the poem is left totally unresolved. I think if you want to put forward in an essay the argument that this poem is representative of the struggle for memory, but specifically about dementia, I think that sense of bewilderment, that sense of unresolved memories, and that sense of confusion captured by the ambiguity of these pronouns is a really effective way of conveying perhaps quite how alarming it would be to suffer from dementia and not be able to successfully identify or recall your memories. So something to bear in mind there if you wanted to put a very powerful argument forth in an essay connecting this poem as an experience of dementia. Finally then, or penultimately, let's have a think about some of the connections. Memory, as I've discussed before, is similarly presented in Before You Were Mine. Presentations of place are perhaps a similar analogue to Never Go Back, where there's a somewhat threatening representation of past places. You might compare the way that childhood is represented in this poem and in Stafford Afternoons, both of which have very, very evocative representations of childhood related particularly to locations. Here are a few more words in a very well-known and well-loved poem by the poet Stevie Smith from her collected poems. This poem is called Not Waving but Drowning. Nobody heard him, the dead man, but still he lay moaning. I was much further out than you thought, and not waving but drowning. Poor chap, he always loved larking, and now he's dead. It must have been too cold for him, his heart gave way, they said. Oh, no, 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 it was too cold always, still the dead one lay moaning. I was much too far out all my life, and not waving, but drowning. Thank you guys for your attention and your focus. Good luck with your revision. If you are finding these materials useful, please pop a comment down on the video to let me know and to offer encouragement. All the best. Bye.